Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our listeners and visitors. We are delighted today in Lead Integrity to welcome someone who has been a tremendous leader in my professional experience and someone who has taught me and continues to teach quite a bit. And that is Jean Duff. Many of you who work in the space of religions, interfaith, will have heard of Jean Duff, the character, the individual, the leader, the person who brings up and uplifts institutions and individuals, and has a tremendous amount of wisdom herself. As a friend, Jean Duff has been someone I have walked alongside at least since 2007, which is when I believe we first met. And at that time, it was under the auspices of the wondrous Dr. Thoraya Obaid, who was then serving as the Undersecretary General and Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund. And Jean was absolutely critical to our attempt to set up the space within the UN system to engage with different religious actors and organizations, namely faith-based NGOs. Jean was one of those who's created some of those NGOs herself, and someone who has a tremendous understanding of the realms of religion in the space of public health, but also in the space of development and various aspects of development. But instead of me talking endlessly, as you know, this Lead Integrity podcast is an opportunity to listen to different kinds of leaders, faith inspired being a key element of their leadership, but by no means the only element. As someone who has traversed this space in so many different guises and ways, Jean, welcome to our podcast on faith inspired leadership. We are delighted to have you. Thank you for making the time. And instead of me speaking any further, I'd like, please, for you to tell us a little bit about your life's journey, how you came to be the Jean Duff that all of us engaged in this space know. What are some of your own experiences that helped form you? And what are some of the things you're working on now?
Thank you so much, Azza, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this podcast series. It's needless to say, a little bit daunting, having listened to some of the others and participated in some of your wonderful webinars and conversations to participate in this process. But I know I trust that you will prompt and guide me with the inquiry and with the conversation. We met as when I was working at the Washington National Cathedral, um, uh, where I've served as the managing director of the then relatively new Center for Global Justice and Reconciliation. Um, that was a completely fascinating platform to find myself in the middle of because of the extraordinary convening power of the cathedral, both at the national level and the global level, and the mandate to see what we might be able to do by way of encouraging interdenominational and interfaith collaboration, both at the national level and perhaps more importantly at the global level, around in what in those days were the Millennium Development Goals. That's how old we are as a, it was the MDG time, and then subsequently working on the Sustainable Development Goals. We took as our two, or we were given by a wonderful gathering of worldwide religious leaders, secretaries general of communions and others. We were given a set of priorities around gender and malaria as two of the priority goals that we should work on, and it was the gender work and the gender focus, the faith and gender focus, that brought me to Thoraya and Dr. Thoraya and to you. So that was the thing. How did I arrive at the cathedral? It's absolutely hilarious. I am a behavioral scientist. I am trained as a clinical psychologist. I have a degree in epidemiology from Columbia, subsequent to my clinical psych. Um, where I specialized in psychiatric epidemiology. So epidemiology is applied to mental health and mental illness. And I finished the coursework for a PhD in community and social psychiatry, but not being an academic and being impatient for action, which I think has been one of the themes of my life, my working life, um, I punted on the dissertation and ended up working at the National Institute of Mental Health in Washington. So that's what basically took me to Washington. Um, I reverted um, after various detours, which are for another conversation, I reverted to my core interest, which was healthy communities and grassroots uh, justice issues. By focusing in the Washington, D.C. area where I was living and raising my family, um, focusing on some of the major social justice issues of the day, including chronic homelessness, which has continued, unfortunately, to be a big challenge in Washington, um, and wherein mental health and mental illness, chronic mental illness and addiction and so forth played an enormous role. Um, and also on a number of projects that looked at social inclusion and in particular social exclusion, on racial and NIMBY grounds and so forth and so on. So I got back into my sort of core area of interest and perhaps semi-competence anyway. I had some reason to be there. Part of that work.
And can I ask you, you said NIMBY, racial and NIMBY. I'm not
Oh,
familiar with
sorry.
NIMBY.
NIMBY is an acronym for not in my backyardism.
Ah, lovely. Thank you
So
for explaining.
it's a kind of a vector of social exclusion that says, well, yes, those dwellings for people with mental disabilities or whatever would be very, very nice, but not in my backyard.
Understood.
So
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
And please don't forget to bring, because you're saying you went back to your core interest. It would be helpful for folks to hear how that became your core interest and your own background from Ireland. Maybe
Okay,
bring that in a bit.
okay.
Yeah, okay, thank
All
you.
right. Okay, thank you so much. So yes, I was born and raised in Ireland. I was so privileged to grow up in a big, extended, stable, loving Irish family, which was just, I was equipped with a backpack of stability and love and backing right from the start. I got a fine education. Um, and I in clinical psychology, as I say, and I came to the United States immediately after qualifying as a psychologist because everything I was interested in by way of the professional work was happening in the States. I was interested in the factors and the indicators for the prevention of mental illness. I wanted to know what were the immunizing factors, what kept people healthy, and what protected people from mental illness and from chronic mental illness. And I was very fortunate to land in a big children's hospital in Western New York in Buffalo, and to be supervised by a phenomenal psychiatrist who got my interest, even though it was kind of a little unorthodox, and who helped me land in the intensive care nursery and in the OBGYN unit, where I was able to work with people in crisis and to set up all kinds of therapy groups and peer-to-peer support groups and so forth and so on. So I was trained there as a family therapist, and I did work in multi-family therapy, which I greatly enjoyed, bringing adolescents, acting out adolescents together with their parents and siblings to talk across families where conversation would have broken down, communication would have broken down, and where there was tremendous therapeutic power in the father in one family establishing a working relationship with a young person in another family and modeling behaviors that would be more positive. Anyhow, um, uh, that took me back to Columbia to research. I realized after some years of that work that my research capability was not up to my interest and my level of inquiry. I wanted to know what was working, of all the various interventions and possibilities. So I ended up at Columbia and just was so fortunate to find the national, probably the world's best group on psychiatric epidemiology there. Just amazing group of people. Um, just going back to my how did I end up with this focus for justice? Uh, Being raised in Ireland, of course, it was not unlikely that I would have been raised Catholic, and I had we were practicing Catholic. It was like the air you breathed. I mean, it wasn't like a big deal. That was just everybody was Catholic, or almost everybody was Catholic. So I was a devout, practicing, active Catholic, but I didn't really particularly know anything about what that meant. Um, but over time, I came to have an understanding of progressive, if you like, intellectual Catholicism, and particularly as exemplified by some of the American leaders and some of the liberation theologians in Latin America, Leonardo Boff and people like that. And so my my identity as a Catholic, which I, even though I work in the faith world, I see myself in the faith world as a behavioral scientist, not as a faith actor myself. So my faith is very important to me, and very much a driver and a point of reference, and a guide, but it's not something I am out front and playing with as a public faith actor myself. So I think that's an important distinction. Um, I think I was radicalized on the justice side um, when I was about 18, and with a dear friend of mine, started an after school literacy and arts thing in a playground, in a kind of a shed, in an extremely impoverished part of inner city Dublin. It was Siobhan's idea that we would do this. And I was sort of tagging along and said, oh, yes, yes, let's do that. That sounds like a good idea. And we found ourselves, I mean, I found myself in a completely unfamiliar and appalling world. I had absolutely no idea hither too that people lived in such very difficult, overcrowded, unsanitary, impoverished conditions, and the kids were under such pressure. Um, our work expanded very, very quickly. I've always been a good organizer, and so we quickly grew to about a group of about 70 student tutors, and running the program 5 days a week. Um, and I guess one of the epiphanies that I had was the discovery when we went to look for one of our young lads who was kind of a regular, and he was a great star. He was such a character, and he hadn't appeared for several days. And I went to the flat where his parents lived, and I asked about him, and they said, "Oh, well, Sean, he's gone to reform. He's gone away." And he was 8, and he had been taken to court for something. I don't know, I even remember what it was. I discovered that the age of criminal responsibility in Ireland at that time was 12. No, sorry, it was 6. So a child could be held criminally responsible in Ireland at that time at 6 years of age.
Un
And so he had been sent away to basically a reform school, a prison for young people. And that just the top of my head came off. I mean, I just I already was learning a great deal about about poverty and life in poverty. But then the top of my head came off, and that was a point in time that really radicalized me. I worked with an amazing team of civil rights lawyers I mean, I only tagged along. I can assure you I had no major power, but I was exposed to this team of lawyers who got the law changed over a couple of years. And I saw that it was possible to make big changes. And I saw that it was possible to make a difference, on the after school program in the lives of the kids. And so that for me was just foundational. And it fit with sort of the Catholic social teaching framing, if you like, in a theological sense. Anyway, fast forward, psychology, epidemiology. I ended up in Washington, D.C. Because I was working at the National Institute of Mental Health, which is located in D.C. And um, got involved with starting a homeless program called the Community Council for the Homeless, um, which was predicated on the idea of the notion that homelessness was a result, always had with it broken relationships, because the last sofa, the last couch, the last lifeboat, the last functioning car, whatever, was no longer an option. And the relationships that went with all of those were broken. So uh, I proposed in a community crisis that was a result of the city's attempt to open a large shelter in a residential neighborhood that was close to where I lived, which provoked the usual, cries and horror and so forth. I proposed as a counter that we would start a small, basically a neighbor to neighbor, settled neighbor to homeless neighbor based community council, and that we would seek to create a network of very small shelters across Washington, um, and 4 to 6 men or women, and that we would organize as community around those congregation-based shelters, to provide support and food, feed, and all that kind of stuff. So that got me into local politics and into a lot of good fights in police stations, and it got me in touch with an extraordinary group of fair housing advocates and civil rights lawyers who are to this day the dearest friends in DC. And it also got me the reputation of being the person who wrote Jesus out of mission statements. Because in the organizing around this process of small scale neighborhood-based work with lots of volunteers, we were drawing together local businesses, local neighborhood associations, local congregations, synagogues, and Christian churches. There were no mosques in the jurisdiction that we were working in at the time. And so, one person would see the local Methodist would see Jesus walking through the door in the form of a homeless man, needing assistance, needing prayer and guidance and assistance. And the secular humanist who was sitting at the table with us and wanted to help would see, a homeless man who was in bad shape, but Jesus basically stood between them, as the something of a barrier to their collaboration, for service to this homeless person. And so I got fairly skilled at interfacing between, we had about 32 congregations involved in this work. And I got fairly skilled at interfacing and kind of mediating this, so finding the common ground. We all want to work on this. We want to add our work together to make a difference for this homeless person. So that's
Why, forgive me, because there's just something to explain to those who may not fully get this picture. Why would Jesus have been seen as a barrier again? Can you elaborate?
because the Methodists wanted to put Jesus into the mission statement for the work. That in the name of Jesus, we come together to provide this service, to share the cloak, to share the crust, whatever. And the secular humanists wanted to do the work, but didn't want to do it in the name of Jesus, thank you very much, and felt excluded by that. And so it was a window for me to learn a great deal and to really go back to my Catholic social teaching
Mm.
with a new frame of reference, because I was working now with many Christian denominations, with Jewish congregations of various conservative to progressive inclination, and um, so it pushed me back into what ended being a 20-year theological study process, where under the leadership of a wonderful Jesuit, we had a group of about 12 to 16, sort of floating group of Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, agnostics, and general inquirers, asking, working, and reflecting and reading around the question of God, not the answer of God, but the question of God, and the question of God in all traditions. So we read everything. We didn't read everything, but we read our way through all of the major sacred texts, and through metaphysics and ethics, and over, as I say, over a 20-year period of inquiry, and it was foundational for me. So meantime, I'm at the practical level, I'm engaged in working a lot with different faith communities in collaboration with civil society organizations, but I'm also really studying and thinking hard about the faith-based approach to all of this, and what are the underlying tenets.
Fantastic. I have now learned so much about you that I had no clue about. And I'm fairly sure that a number of us who've worked with you for decades also equally didn't know about that background in behavioral science, the work that you did. I love the fact that of how you described that you somehow took Jesus out of the mission statement in order to get the work itself done in the name of whoever and whatever one believes in, but at least you can work in collaboratively. I think that that's exactly some of the stuff that we need to do more of today in so many different domains. So, with that incredibly rich series of backgrounds, because it's not just one thing you did, you've obviously been involved in so much. Um, how do you see the world of our interfaith engagement today, whether at the global level or the local levels? How do you see some of this work, some of which you contributed to yourself significantly, but also some of that is going around you? Tell us a little bit about the wisdom that you accrued from such a wealth of experience in different domains of engagement for social justice.
Well, I think so much of my career, if I can call it that, so much of my work life has sort of been accidental. It hasn't. I haven't sought or applied for a job. I mean, it was to my complete astonishment that I ended up working in a faith context. I was recruited to it by Bishop John Chain, who was the Bishop of Washington at the time, who wanted to start a Center for Global Justice at the National Cathedral, and he invited me to prepare a business plan, a document, because he knew that I had had this engagement between the faith and secular worlds, and he knew that I had been fundraising quite successfully for some of this work, and so it was a pleasure to do that. It was so interesting and such a challenge, and an opportunity to speak to so many leaders and think it through. And I presented the business plan and went back to working at that time on the homeless stuff. And in due course, I was invited to become involved in this new center. And so it was completely accidental and astonishing. I mean, hilarious, really, because I felt so completely unqualified. Um, but there is this sort of sense of praying about something like this, and considering it in a spiritual reflection. And it seemed like a very noble invitation, and one that I ought to consider. I should take it seriously. It came to me as an unexpected gift, and even though I felt completely unworthy of it, I sort of said, okay, well, I'll give it a go. I'll give it a go. So that, just by way of preamble to answering your question about what I learned. So uh, I found myself in a situation as non-clergy in a cathedral, which was organized. The center was a satellite program of a cathedral that was focused on liturgy and prayer and music and worship and so forth and so on, in a high learning mode, because we had the opportunity to convene leaders of so many different denominations and faith communities, and to forge collaborations. I knew a lot by then about building coalitions and forging collaborations among people who had come from different perspectives. But now I was working particularly in a context of institutional religion and institutional faith leaders, and learning a great deal about their approach and their mandates and their mechanisms, and indeed some of the barriers to collaboration. And so I suppose that part of what I came to understand was the institutional siloing, that religious institutions were no different from other institutions, in that the vitality and the survival and the growth of the institution itself was a goal that transcended so many of the core values that might otherwise have been the drivers. And so, if the core value is compassion and justice or whatever, in many cases, the leaders of the institutions who were serving as effectively the CEOs were institution building and competing with each other for funds and prowess, and also in some cases, for the one true way. And so the one true way to God, that some of the institutions were very, very concerned with the one true way to God. So I guess over the time, I observed a lot about that. My theology study work was very, very helpful as a place of reflection, safe place for reflection and discussion about some of the things we were seeing. But I also found, Asa, that properly structured collaboration was more than possible. That it was joyful and stone soup like. You made the pot, and once the pot was made, and the promise of soup and something to eat together was on the table, that indeed people would bring, and institutions and their agents would bring extraordinary gifts to the table, and that we were able to, I guess. I guess the breakthrough that I understood and that I experienced and was a bit involved in was creating the environment where people found themselves working together across denominational and faith lines for the first time. That they hadn't had that environment before, that they hadn't had the possibility of breaking bread together, the possibility of friendship, the possibility of attending each other's children's weddings. I mean, we had come up through a period that was placing a lot of emphasis on interreligious dialogue. And while I was really interested in interreligious dialogue and learning all the time, I mean, again, I felt such an outsider. I was really a student of this and learning. What I really understood to be much more important, as an activist, as somebody who wanted a measurable difference. I mean, remember, I'm trained as an epidemiologist. I know a lot about measurable outcomes and measurable differences, and that for me guided the priority of action. So that if you want to have a measurable difference, that you've got to be very clear about what that is, and then organize for it. But that it was possible. I mean, that was my learning in that situation.
Since you mentioned measurable difference, I love the fact that you spoke so clearly and I think cogently to the coming together as human beings, the breaking bread together, the attending each other's children's weddings, the humanity of the interaction of dialogue on a daily basis. It's not just coming together for a meeting, but it is actually engaging in each other's lives and together with one another. And I love that the metaphor that you brought out so clearly. You mentioned the measurable. And I know that from the work with you on the joint learning, when you created the joint learning initiative, for instance, there was always an emphasis that you had, which now makes a lot of sense to me, given that I know a little bit more about your background, this idea of evidence-based, of measurable outcomes. How do you see the work that has been done since with interfaith engagement, whether on development or issues of public health or issues of environment, as you're stewarding now, and I hope you will be able to mention the Women, Faith, and Climate Network. But how do you see that the work of the interfaith world, is it measurable now? Is it more measurable now? Is it more driven by measurements now from that perspective that you have and that you've nurtured for so long? Is interfaith work more measurable today? And if so, how?
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's a good question. For me, the emphasis on measurement, and obviously it came out of my background and my training, but it seemed to me to be an absolute prerequisite for expanding interfaith action and collaborative action across faith lines for justice, for sustainable development goals and humanitarian goals. That if you couldn't actually measure it, you wouldn't be able to fund it at scale, and you wouldn't be able to have accountability for quality and for excellence and so forth. So that was a prerequisite for me. You were among the colleagues. We used to get together at international conferences and so forth and bemoan the fact that even though faith communities were doing such important work and actually contributing a lot, that that secular organizations, that governments and multilaterals did take the faith community seriously, and often very actively preferred not to engage with faith communities. Concerns about partiality of service and concerns about proselytizing were among the major spoken barriers. And indeed, a whole variety of attitudes coming from secular society, predicated against engaging with faith. And so, as I say, you were among those early conversations where we would get together and we'd go around and around and we would talk about what given the excellent work that was ongoing and the urgent necessity of scaling through collaboration, scaling for positive outcomes through collaboration, what could make the difference. And we together arrived at the idea, at the notion that the faith community in general paid very little attention to documenting or to accounting for its work, because it seemed internally self-evident that it was good. And as long as it was good, and as long as it was true to code, whatever the particular theology and scripture was, and the mandates was, that it was fine. There was absolutely no need. And so I think what we together, and you were very much part of the framing of this, part of the board and the leadership of this, what we and many others together decided to do was to actually focus in on improving the quality and the availability of the evidence for faith activities and faith contributions. And that out of that idea came something called the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, which I was privileged to serve. You and others, we talked a lot about how we're going to get this off the ground and where we're going to get the money and who's going to lead it. And we identified one person among our number who would be a great leader. And I was tagged to go off and ask that person, would they do that? And she very wisely said no. And so I came back to the group and said, well, and they said, well, would you do it? And I said, well, okay. So I ended up, again, accidents, I ended up being the coordinator of the Joint Learning Initiative. And that was amazing. I think we had partners across the religious spectrum, both religious organizations and also faith-based NGOs. All of the major faith-based NGOs ended up partnering and being involved. And I think that the difference that got made was that everybody realized that it made a great deal of sense for mission to become a lot better and a lot more professional and a lot more scientific about tracking activity and tracking contributions. And we could measure that by maybe looking at the extent of growth in research staff, the extent of growth in communications that was evidence-based coming out of these kinds of organizations. So that was the beginning of it. And I think that the Joint Learning Initiative has gone on from strength to strength and has been an important influence. Again, a huge collaboration. I mean, it ended up being, our methodology, as you remember, was learning hubs. So we would organize a learning hub around a specific theme, peacekeeping, gender-based violence, etc. And folks would come in from many, many different constituencies, not just faith-based constituencies, academics, policymakers, and so forth, pool information, ask ourselves what we don't know, commission research, get the research funded, and then publish and share that information. So it was a wonderful circular collaborative process that I think did make a difference and probably continues to make a difference today. I think the side effect also of the of improving in evidence is that we saw a much greater public engagement by governments, the opening of faith-based offices in the US government across many of the departments. The UN agencies began to much more actively, and again, your leadership was absolutely pivotal here. I mean, without you, you were the pioneer and the translator, the interpreter, I think, for so many of the UN agencies. But I think that they began to take the possibility of engaging with faith much more seriously and on pragmatic terms. So going back to my own background as a behavioral scientist, I work and have continued, for so many decades to work with the faith community because of the tremendous influence for positive attitude and behavior change that religious leadership can deliver. Most particularly in low-income situations, most particularly in situations that are under duress, but by no means exclusively. Which doesn't to say, for a second, that I don't also notice the negative influence, the profoundly negative influence of so many faith communities. But turning it over, my interest and my inquiry for so many years now has been how to support the most positive influence at scale of faith communities through their own and faith-based NGOs, through their own work, but also through their collaboration. So that if you can get collaborating faith communities set up around a paradigm for positive change, help them be educated contextually in the appropriate context for their beliefs and their doctrines, and lay out an action plan where they can make a difference, then it's a win-win situation. So I've always been interested in the powerful influence from a behavioral science point of view. And maybe just to say a little bit about the work in Nigeria, would that be interesting?
Yes, please
Um,
go ahead.
when I was working at the cathedral, we engaged with a number of UN agencies, including the World Bank. And the World Bank had made a massive commitment of funds, together with USAID and the Global Fund and others, towards the countering the public health crisis in Nigeria in relation to malaria. The mortality rates among under fives and pregnant women were extremely high. And a large amount of money, had millions and millions and millions of dollars, had been allocated for a long-lasting insecticide-treated nets campaign. And folks at the World Bank began to realize that those nets were probably going to end up as fishing aids and wedding veils. And they were feeling vulnerable about they were feeling that the capital expenditure was basically at risk, and as such they were open to the unorthodox idea of engaging with the faith communities for influence and education of their populations. So we had the opportunity as the Center for Global Justice and Reconciliation to work with the bank and work with the Nigerian Ministry of Health to basically set up a national collaboration, national Muslim Christian collaboration with the Sultan of Sokoto and the then Archbishop John Anaike in Nigeria, who together led very, very creatively and brilliantly something called the Nigerian Interfaith Action Association. And through that, in close collaboration with the Ministry of Health and funded by the World Bank, a massive outreach and mobilization of Muslim leaders and Christian pastors was undertaken to educate them about the malaria prevention, use of nets, so forth and so on. And as a result, in a comparison of states where the faith community was mobilized, in addition to the Ministry of Health versus Ministry of Health alone, there was a result that showed a much greater level of children under 5 and pregnant women sleeping under nets where the faith mobilization was added. So that's an example
Tangible reality, a tangible example of something working when you engage the faith actors.
exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. Yeah.
So from that brilliant example, with the few minutes left to us, I need to ask you two questions related to the moment we're living in now. That our dynamics have changed significantly. USAID no longer exists, which no one would have thought possible just a few months ago. The development terrain is changing, and humanitarian terrain is changing as we speak. Are there examples that you can point to in the relatively more recent history that show the value added of the multi-faith collaboration actually making a tangible difference similar to the one you've just cited? Is there something a bit more recent that you can point to or you'd like to alert to that has that same measurable evidence of success collaboration? And then I'll ask you the last question after that. But tell me, think together with me and mention something that you would like to point to that is equally tangible in a slightly more modern, relatively recent context. And if you can't, or if you find it more difficult, tell me what you see are the main challenges today or impediments, if you will, to some of this tangible evidence shattering interfaith collaboration.
Yep. Yeah, things certainly have changed. And I think the institutional considerations for religions have become much stiffer and more rigid and more insistent and more extreme in many ways. So there are maybe old challenges have come to the fore now again that are mitigating the kind of collaboration. Maybe we've had a golden era of interreligious collaboration that is now at least in abeyance, if not in jeopardy. Um, as you know, and we've done it together a lot. Um, my approach is tends to be quite entrepreneurial in the face of barriers, and I've kind of had a methodology in my mind of seeing a gap and going and standing in a gap and seeing if Asa will come and stand in the gap too, or maybe I'll stand in Asa's gap. And then we might recruit some other people to stand in the gap with us, and then we might build something around it. So very kind of unorthodox, slightly guerrilla change making activities. So my optimism about multi-religious collaboration going forward is entirely grounded in returning to the grassroots and particularly to women's leadership. And so I've been investing a lot of hope and energy and joy in something that you have provided great leadership for, called the Women, Faith and Climate Network. And here the big idea is that every religious group, be they indigenous, Buddhist, Christian, Baha'i, Muslim, whatever, has organized women, networks of women, societies of women who are working globally, nationally, regionally, but most particularly at the local level for the well-being of their communities. And the big and anytime you look and lift the lid of what those networks are doing, those women of faith networks, always a piece of it relates to healthy environment, sustainable environment, healthy families, and to climate. And so the big idea of the Women, Faith and Climate Network is that we would bring together the leaders, the leadership of these women of faith networks from around the world and talk about what it is that they're now doing in climate, what they could do more of, how they might collaborate, and see about scaling that up. And you've been such an important leader in these meetings that we've had. The collaboration, it's electric, absolutely electric. We've talked a lot about the particular way of leadership and being together and mutual support and compassion in these sessions, and the call that has come out of it for radical collaboration. So there is explicit interest and request for the resourcing of radical collaboration among women of faith across faith lines at the local level to do more of this amazing and essential and urgent work of securing our planet for future generations. So I offer that as even in these really dark and difficult times where we're so divided and where in the name of God, of all gods, so much terrible, real evil is being delivered. In these very, very difficult times. I hope, I have enormous hope from the ordinary, practical faith inspiration of women continuing the work. And it takes us back to all of the best of the theologies of the practical, compassionate, caring, community building nature, which they haven't gone away. They're there. They're core to all of our religions. Love is at the core to all of our religions, and it hasn't gone away. It's being acted out by many, including these women.
Hmm. That's a lovely note to conclude with. I just want you to perhaps, if you can, nuance a bit this incredibly powerful message um, in regards to a specific evil of genocide that we're seeing unfold that is leading to so much pain and trauma globally, and is contributing actually in different ways to transforming our geopolitical system and certainly impacting on our actual as well as metaphysical environment, if you will.
Mm.
What are some of your thoughts, Jean, as a woman of such diverse wisdom, passion, as you see what we're all living through right now and hard to avoid on our TV screens, on our newspapers? What are some of what gives you hope? Um, what do you want to see happen? What is it that keeps you going in view
Mm.
of all of that?
It is indeed a challenge in the face of such pain and such evil, really. What keeps me going? Um, the hundreds of organizations of collaboration between Palestinians and Jews who seek to build a future together, a two-state solution or variations on that theme. We don't hear about these collaborations very much, but they are there. They are there, and that is extremely important. That gives me hope. Um, I have hope for the political courage that shown by even small countries like Ireland, who have been among the first to acknowledge the Palestinian state and to call out the behavior of the Israeli government. I greatly worry and deplore um, the manipulation of the notion of anti-Semitism and its confusion with anti-Israeli government policy. And I refuse to be put into a box where if I decry the massacre of innocent people in Palestine, that therefore I must be anti-Semitic. Or any of us must be. The idea it is either or. Um, so in Irish politics, it would be the equivalent to saying that in former times, if one decried the behavior of the Irish Republican Army, therefore one was anti-Irish. It is so unnuanced, and how is it that we could possibly have got ourselves into a situation where anti-Semitism has become a broad term to cover and to protect the genocidal actions of the Israeli government towards the Palestinian people. So, honestly, it's such a complex thing. I worry greatly about it, but I hope that again through collaboration. I point to these collaborations that I know. One of my friends is very involved in observing these and has counted more than 600 such collaborations across the two states. So my hope is in the one-to-one human person-to-person breaking bread collaboration that is a thread, I think, through so much of our multi-faith, multi-religious collaboration in our experience.
Amen. From your lips to the gates of heaven, may we see more, may we learn more of those collaborations, and may they transform. Jean Duff, it has been an absolute pleasure, as always, learning from you, listening to you, hearing your wisdom. Very, very helpful and very instructive, I think, to see how the various threads of your life are actually not so diverse, but they come together so beautifully by accident, as you say, haphazardly, as you say, and yet in such a nuanced, meaningful, transformative, powerful way to make a difference to all of us who have had an opportunity to work with you, the privilege of being able to work alongside you. So thank you. There's no way that I can ever capture the gratitude that people like me feel, and many of us who work with you and have had the pleasure of working with you under so many guises. It is people like you, I think, who symbolize and signify a tremendous amount of leadership that does not claim credit for itself, which is why I wanted to make sure we could feature you as Jean Duff, because you would never claim that credit for yourself, but you so deserve it. Thank you for being the example, the model, and thank you for the work that you continue to do to serve humanity.
Thank you, Asa. With you.
I'm going to pause the recording.